gave himself a knighthood. Not a real one. Not one from a government or a monarch or any authority that had the power to grant such a thing. He simply decided he deserved one. Had himself declared a Knight Commander of the Order of Merit of Antigua and Barbuda, and started wearing the uniform. White naval jacket, gold epaulets, ceremonial medals. His name was Allen Stanford, and the knighthood was the least audacious lie he ever told. Between 1986 and 2009, Stanford ran a Ponzi scheme that stole over $7 billion from approximately 18,000 investors in 113 countries. He did it from a tiny island in the Caribbean. He did it while sponsoring cricket tournaments and hosting prime ministers. He did it while the SEC watched and did almost nothing for nearly a decade. He is currently in federal prison. His scheduled release date is March 13th, 2103. He will be 153 years old. This is the story of Allen Stanford, the self-knighted fraudster who almost got away with it. Robert Allen Stanford was born on March 24th, 1950, in Mexia, Texas. He grew up in modest circumstances, attended Baylor University, and graduated with a degree in finance in 1974. His early business career was unremarkable. He tried a gym business in Waco, Texas in the 1980s that eventually went bankrupt. He had a real estate business that struggled. What Stanford had, an enormous supply, was ambition, self-belief, and a talent for projecting success he did not yet have. In 1986, he moved to the Caribbean island of Montserrat and founded a small offshore bank. He later relocated to Antigua, a small island nation in the Eastern Caribbean, and established Stanford International Bank. Antigua was not a coincidence. It was a calculation. Antigua had weak financial regulation, a government that was hungry for foreign investment, and almost no meaningful oversight of its banking sector. Stanford cultivated relationships with Antiguan politicians, donating millions of dollars to the government, funding infrastructure projects, sponsoring sports and cultural events. He became the most powerful private citizen on the island. The government gave him land. They allowed him to build. They looked the other way. Stanford International Bank offered customers certificates of deposit, essentially a promise that if you deposited your money, you would earn a fixed guaranteed return, far higher than anything available at conventional American banks. While U.S. banks were offering 3 or 4%, Stanford was offering 8, 9, 10% or more, consistently, year after year, through market crashes and recessions. He told investors his returns came from a unique, proprietary investment strategy. A diversified portfolio managed by a team of 20 analysts monitoring 30 markets worldwide. The portfolio, he claimed, had never had a losing year. It was a complete fabrication. The money deposited by new investors was used to pay the promised returns to older investors, the classic Ponzi structure. But a significant portion of the money, billions of dollars, was simply stolen. Stanford used investor funds to finance a lifestyle of almost incomprehensible extravagance. He owned a fleet of private jets. He owned yachts. He built an enormous personal compound in Antigua. He sponsored cricket, a sport he had adopted as part of his Caribbean persona, spending tens of millions of dollars to create the Stanford Super Series, a 2020 cricket tournament where he offered a $20 million winner-take-all prize. He flew players to Antigua on his private jet. He sat in a glass box at matches counting cash. He gave himself the title Sir Allen Stanford. He had business cards printed with it. He used it in official correspondence. He demanded to be addressed by it. The SEC began receiving complaints about Stanford as early as 1997. Financial analysts who examined the publicly available information about Stanford International Bank concluded that the returns he claimed were mathematically impossible given any known legitimate investment strategy. The same conclusion that Harry Markopolos had reached about Madoff years earlier. The SEC conducted examinations of Stanford's U.S. operations in 1997, 1998, 2002, and 2004. Each time, they found evidence of fraud. Each time, they failed to act. An SEC enforcement attorney named Julie Pruitt repeatedly recommended formal action against Stanford. Her superiors repeatedly overruled her. The case was categorized as low priority. Resources were directed elsewhere. For nearly 12 years, the SEC sat on evidence of one of the largest ongoing frauds in American history. Meanwhile, Stanford expanded. He moved his U.S. brokerage operations to Houston. He opened offices across the country. He hired thousands of financial advisors who sold his certificates of deposit to American clients, retirees, teachers, small business owners, who had no idea the money was going to an offshore bank with essentially no oversight. Stanford also spent millions on American political influence. He donated to both parties. He hired lobbyists. He worked to shape legislation around offshore banking regulation. He attended Washington events. He was photographed with senators and congressmen. The fraud finally unraveled in late 2008, the same wave of financial panic that had exposed Madoff. As global markets collapsed, Stanford's investors began requesting withdrawals in large numbers. Like every Ponzi scheme, Stanford International Bank could not meet the demand. The money simply was not there. On February 17, 2009, the SEC charged Stanford with fraud, describing a massive ongoing fraud involving $7 billion in certificates of deposit. The FBI raided Stanford's offices in Houston, Memphis, and Tupelo, Mississippi. Stanford fled. He was found in Virginia, living in a rented house with a former girlfriend. On June 18, 2009, he surrendered to federal authorities. While awaiting trial, Stanford was attacked by another inmate in a prison altercation and suffered a serious head injury. He claimed it left him with memory impairment and addiction to anti-anxiety medication, a condition his defense team would later argue made him unfit to stand trial. The judge disagreed. On March 6, 2012, after a 5-week trial, Allen Stanford was convicted on 13 of 14 counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice.
I hereby sentence Allen Stanford to 110 years in federal prison.
His CFO, James Davis, his college roommate and co-conspirator from the very beginning, cooperated with prosecutors and received 5 years. Stanford's chief accounting officer received 20 years. The court-appointed receiver assigned to recover funds for victims managed to claw back approximately $2.5 billion, including over $1 billion from Toronto Dominion Bank, which had processed Stanford transactions and settled a lawsuit related to its role. That left roughly $4.7 billion unrecovered. The 18,000 victims, spread across 113 countries, received partial repayments. Many received far less than half of what they had lost. Many received nothing at all. Among the hardest hit were Latin American investors, particularly in Venezuela, Mexico, and Colombia, who had trusted Stanford's bank with life savings, retirement funds, and business assets accumulated over decades. In January 2025, a federal judge finally closed the SEC's 16-year-old civil case against Stanford, ordering billions in fines that will almost certainly never be paid. Stanford was declared indigent in 2010. He owns nothing. He is 76 years old and will die in prison. The SEC's failure in the Stanford case became one of the most damning examples of regulatory negligence in the history of American finance. An internal SEC investigation after Stanford's arrest found that the agency's Fort Worth office had repeatedly identified Stanford's fraud and repeatedly failed to pursue it, partly due to institutional dysfunction, partly due to career concerns, and partly because the case was offshore and therefore considered someone else's problem. Julie Pruitt, the enforcement attorney who had repeatedly tried to bring action against Stanford, was praised in the post-mortem. Her warnings had been ignored for more than a decade. The SEC also failed with Madoff. It also failed with Stanford, two of the largest Ponzi schemes in history. And in both cases, regulators had been warned years in advance and done nothing. That pattern is not a coincidence. It is a systemic failure. A failure of an agency that was under-resourced, politically influenced, and institutionally resistant to confronting powerful men with money and connections. Allen Stanford was not a genius. His fraud was not sophisticated. He sold certificates of deposit from an offshore bank and promised returns that anyone with a basic financial education could identify as suspicious. He got away with it for 20 years because he was charming, because he spent money on politicians and lobbyists, because he operated offshore where oversight was minimal, and because the institution that was supposed to stop him looked the other way. Repeatedly, deliberately, for over a decade. The victims of Allen Stanford are still out there. Retirees in Texas who lost everything. Families in Venezuela who trusted their life savings to a man in a white naval uniform. People who did nothing wrong except believe that a bank supervised by a government was actually being supervised. They were wrong, and they paid for it with everything they had. That is the story of Allen Stanford, the self-knighted con man from Texas who built a $7 billion fraud on a Caribbean island and nearly got away with it while the regulators watched. If this story made you think about where your money is and who is really watching over it, Check the link in the description. Your financial identity is worth protecting every single day. Subscribe to Dark Ledger. Every week we go deeper on the crimes, the frauds, and the scandals that shaped the modern world. The next one you won't see coming.